Other organizers or panelists on the line. When you are ready to begin the presentation, press the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast.
Hi, my name is Mike Lau, and I'm a therapist at Health Corrections. And what I'd like to do is talk to you today about non-suicidal self-injury. Non-suicidal self-injury is, by definition, the act of deliberately harming your own body. It's typically not meant as a suicidal attempt, but rather self-injury is an unhealthy way to cope with emotional pain, intense anger, or frustration. Some of the signs and symptoms that we see with individuals who will self-harm come across as things as scars, such as in the form of burns or cuts. We often see fresh cuts such as scratches, bruises, or other wounds, broken bones. Individuals will keep sharp objects on hand, wearing long sleeves or long pants even when the weather is extremely hot. Individuals who claim to have frequent accidents, they spend a great deal of time alone. Individuals who have difficulties in interpersonal relationships, but these difficulties are pervasive, they're long-standing, they're chronic. Persistent questions about their own personal identity. For example, constant questioning of who they are, what they're about, where they're going in life. Behavioral and emotional instability, and often will the individual experience statements of helplessness, hopelessness, or worthlessness. One of these statements or two of these statements or signs and symptoms in and of themselves is not often a direct cause and effect of self-harm. But if we find a number of these signs and symptoms kind of clumped together, this often raises a red flag for a clinician. There are a number of different forms of self-injury, so it's not simply the cutting that we see. Burning, for example, can be a form of self-injury. Carving words or symbols on the skin, breaking bones, hitting or punching themselves, piercing of the skin, head banging, things like biting, pulling of the hair, and persistently picking at or interfering with the healing process, such as scars. So there's a number of different forms of self-injury outside of just the typical or the more common form, I guess, of just cutting on oneself. What is self-injury about? As I said in the definition, self-injury is not about suicide. The individual is often, their goal is not about trying to kill themselves, not trying to take their own lives. So it's not about suicide. What self-injury is about is mostly about the individual controlling their own internal emotional pain. It is a form of self-injury. Self-harm is a form of self-injury. It has been a practice that has long existed in secrecy. Oftentimes it takes a long time for somebody to figure out that somebody in their family, that a friend is actually harming themselves. In recent years, movies, popular TV shows have drawn attention to it. I think kind of promoting, the number of teens and tweens, 14, the individuals trying self-injury, self-harm. Tweens are typically those from 9 to 14. We usually see self-injury or self-harm begin around the age of 14, and it can continue even up to the age of 30 and beyond. Individuals who keep doing it for years and years don't really know how to quit. And so it almost becomes a habit or an addiction. Self-harm, self-injury is particularly common among girls, but boys will engage in self-harm and self-injury. It's often a coping strategy for kids who are unhappy, and it can often be found as a defense for what's going on in a child's family or an adolescent's family and in that individual's lives. The more severe cases, self-injury, self-harm, can be seen as a symptom for a psychiatric problem, a more severe psychiatric problem. Many of the kids who do self-harm are quote-unquote regular kids who are just experimenting. When this happens, when the experimentation just happens and these kids stop the self-harm or the self-injury, it does stop completely. It's when it continues that we see a pretty serious problem that could develop into a more serious psychiatric problem. What happens is that when individuals self-harm or they self-injure in many of its different forms, it creates what we call a feel-good feeling, similar to that feeling of an adolescent or an adult taking a certain type of drug. Self-injury has often been kind of linked to that similar effect that, for example, cocaine may have. Kind of releases the endorphins, and that's where they get that feel-good feeling. Typically with self-injury, if it does work for an individual, that's an indication that there's an underlying issue that needs to be dealt with. So if they are getting relief of some emotional pain, some internal pain, that's an indication that it is quote-unquote working for that individual. If the individual is relatively healthy, again, that's more of an experimentation. The individual may try it, but they're not going to continue with the self-injury or the self-harm. As I said, with that feel-good feeling, there is kind of a painkiller effect to self-harm and self-injury. Over time, self-harm will typically escalate if there is an underlying problem going on. So we kind of see a tolerance effect taking place. It takes more and more cutting to get the same kind of relief that it did at the beginning. The treatment that is involved in self-injury and self-harm, we have to understand that kids, that adolescents, that young adults are going to talk when they're ready. When they are ready, typically that first line of defense is psychotherapy or counseling. It's usually the first step that we take in treatment. When they're ready to talk, if mom and dad can get the child, the adolescent, into treatment, therapy and counseling is that first step. The ultimate linchpin is that individual has to decide that they're not going to do it anymore. Okay, they have to make up their own mind that this is a problem and that they're going to stop doing it. The goal is to actually try to communicate, to help them, to help the child, help the adolescent, the young adult, help them communicate what's wrong, what's going on, what the underlying emotional pain is. We try to help them gain self-respect, and we try to help them gain some self-esteem. We often find that their own confidence is extremely low, and we try to help them believe that it's okay to say no to people. Again, we find very low self-respect, low self-esteem, hard to stand up for themselves, hard to say no to people. Okay, we try to help them empower themselves. Parents can often help by providing emotional support. Parents need to understand that they need to be there for the child, for the adolescent, And they need to provide that emotional support, help identify early warning signs, help kids distract themselves, lowering the child's stress level, and providing supervision as much as possible at those critical times when the child may feel like they need to cut, they need to burn, or they need to engage in some of those various forms of self-harm. So what we do again in treatment is we try to honor when the adolescent is ready to talk. Again, psychotherapy is that first line of defense, and work with the child, the adolescent's parents, and providing emotional support, building up that self-respect, that self-esteem. Also understanding that there's no individual antidepressant, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic medication that can be prescribed to stop the self-cutting. Any kind of medication is going to be prescribed for any other kind of co-occurring disorder, such as depression or anxiety. It's not going to be prescribed to stop the cutting. That's only going to be looked at through the psychotherapy. Again, today what I talked about was various forms, signs and symptoms, and some treatment of self-harm. I want to thank you for listening. For more information or to schedule an appointment at Health Directions, you can call 815-224-1610. If you have any questions about today's webinar, you can email us at communications@ncbhs.org. If you want to listen into some more webinars on various topics, you can visit us at www.healthdirectionsonline.org. Thank you.